Origins of the Cold War, Lesson 38. How did the United States and the Soviet Union become Cold War adversaries? In the spring of 1945, as World War II began to draw to a close, in Europe, a historic encounter occurred between the U.S. and Soviet troops in Germany. Although the Americans and Soviets had been allies in the war, they had not yet fought together. Now the two forces prepared to meet as they moved into Germany. As the U.S. Army advanced eastward, small patrols were sent ahead of the U.S. main forces in search of Soviet troops. Lieutenant Albert Kotzebue, a 21-year-old officer from Texas, led one of the small patrols. In on April 25th, as his men approached the Elbe River near the German city of Torgau, they spotted a Soviet patrol on the opposite bank. Shouting and waving frantically, they spotted a Soviet patrol on the opposite bank. Shouting and waving frantically, they caught the Soviet soldiers' attention. The men on the other side pointed and waved back, yelling, Amerikanski, Amerikanski. Lieutenant Kotzebue found a small boat near the shore and made his way across the river where the Soviet and U.S. soldiers greeted each other warmly. Several of these informal meetings took place along the Elbe, but later the senior commanders of the two armies exchanged more formal visits. Photographers recorded the historic occasion of one such meeting, capturing an image of a GI and Soviet soldiers shaking hands. Working together, the Allies would accelerate the end of the war in Europe, an event noted President Harry Truman, for which all the American people, all the British people, and all the Soviet people had toiled and prayed so long. The friendly meetings on the Elbe further hinted at a continuing partnership between the United States and the Soviet Union. However, the days of the U.S. and Soviet soldiers hugging and shaking hands would not last. Before long, the United States and the Soviet Union would engage in a grim struggle for world power known as the Cold War. As one momentous global conflict ended, another was about to begin. The two countries would soon become bitter enemies. Forming an uneasy peace. During the war, the United States and the USSR formed an alliance based on mutual interest, setting aside their political and cultural differences to focus on the shared goal of defeating Germany. These differences resurfaced, however, once the war ended and the Allies began to plan for the post-war era. A wartime alliance begins to erode. Before the end of the war, in February 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill met in the Soviet city of Yalta for the Yalta Conference. During these mostly amicable talks, they agreed to collaborate in shaping post-war Europe, deciding to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones, separately controlled by each Allied country. They also declared their support for self-government and free elections in Eastern Europe. Roosevelt returned from Yalta, hopeful that the Allies could maintain friendly relations, but they would soon weaken instead. After Germany was defeated, the Allied leaders convened again in July, this time in Potsdam near Berlin. President Harry S. Truman now represented the United States due to FDR's death 3 months prior. Churchill, who was later replaced by new British Prime Minister Clement Attlee, and Stalin also attended. At this Potsdam conference, the Allied leaders finalized their post-war plans for Germany, including the division of Berlin into occupation zones. The atmosphere at Potsdam was tense. Truman learned that the United States had tested its first atomic bomb. The conference and hinted to Stalin that the United States possessed a powerful new weapon, although he did not name it. This fueled Stalin's distrust of the United States on par with Truman's wariness toward Stalin. The Soviet army still occupied much of Eastern Europe, and Truman was suspicious of their intentions. The Soviet leader had pledged to allow free elections in Eastern Europe, but his promise had not yet been fulfilled. In fact, the Soviets helped rig elections in Poland to ensure a communist win. Truman and Stalin clearly envisioned very different versions of post-war Europe. Security concerns motivated many of Stalin's decisions. Germany had attacked the Soviet Union in both world wars, using Poland as its invasion route, so Stalin wanted to create a buffer zone of friendly communist states to protect the USSR. Believing control of Eastern Europe was critical to the nation's security, Stalin claimed the region as a Soviet sphere of influence. On the other hand, Truman wanted to allow Eastern European nations to determine their own form of government, believing that with free choice they would select democracy. The US and the USSR count up the costs of war. The United States and the USSR envisioned Europe's future differently, partly because of their different experiences in World War II. The USSR had sustained enormous casualties, as many as 20 million. Soviet citizens died in the war, including at least 7 million soldiers. Many were killed or died of disease in German labor camps, while others starved when invading Nazi forces stripped the Soviet countryside of crops, farm animals, and equipment, and torched farms and villages. In addition, the Nazis leveled several Soviet cities, including Stalingrad and Kiev. Flying into the USSR in 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower observed, "I did not see a house standing between the western borders of the country and Moscow." In contrast, the United States suffered comparatively less from the war. Approximately 290,000 U.S. soldiers died, but civilian casualties were limited to those killed or wounded in the Pearl Harbor attack. Other than Pearl Harbor, no fighting took place on U.S. soil. No American cities were bombed, and none of the country's farms or factories were destroyed. In fact, the U.S. economy boomed during the war. By 1945, the United States was producing over half the world's total industrial output. The United States had spent at least $320 billion to finance the war, but most Americans felt that the money was well spent. President Truman called it an investment in world freedom and world peace. Like the rest of Europe, the Soviet Union wanted aid to help rebuild after the war, and asked the United States for a loan. Truman, angered by Stalin's broken promises and disregard of the Yalta agreements, regarded the Soviet Union with a get-tough attitude. Shortly after Germany fell, Truman terminated Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviet Union, even ordering American ships already traveling to the Soviet Union to return home. Stalin declared Truman's actions, quote, brutal. Different ideologies shaped the U.S. and USSR. The differences between the United States and the Soviet Union stemmed from more than wartime experiences. Their dispute also reinstated stark differences in ideology or a set of beliefs that formed the basis of a political and economic system. The U.S. system centered on democratic government and capitalist economics. In a capitalist system, individuals and private businesses make most economic decisions. Business owners decide what to produce, and consumers choose what to buy. Most property, factories, and equipment are privately owned. The United States hoped that capitalist democracy would spread throughout Europe after the war. Meanwhile, the USSR hoped European countries would favor its communist system. Communists regard capitalists as an unjust system that creates great social inequalities, denying the proletariat or working class of a fair share of society's wealth. Communism is structured by a single-party political control and government economic control. The state owns and operates most businesses, determining what goods will be produced. This system is also referred to as a command or centrally planned economy. In this system, small farms are often joined together to form collectives, owned jointly by its farmers and the state. This economic arrangement is known as collectivism. Section 2, adjusting to a post-war world. By 1946, the global balance of power was shifting. Two world wars and severe destruction of economic infrastructure had greatly weakened the formerly dominant Britain, France, and Germany. Now the United States and the Soviet Union stood alone as the world's leading powers. Their size and economic strength and military prowess enabled them to dominate global affairs. The two countries thusly became known as superpowers, or nations that influence or control less powerful states. Most nations chose or were forced to align with one of these superpowers, dividing the world into two power blocks. Tensions rise between the two superpowers. In February of 1946, Stalin delivered a speech that attacked capitalism, declaring that peace was impossible if capitalism existed. He asserted that capitalist nations would perpetually compete with one another for raw materials and markets for their products, and that such conflicts would always be settled by armed force. War, Stalin said, was inevitable under the present capitalist conditions of world economic development. His speech seemed to suggest that communism should replace capitalism. George Kennan, a U.S. diplomat at the American Embassy in Moscow, studied Stalin's speech and sent a long analysis to the U.S. Secretary of State. This long telegram, as it became known, helped shape U.S. foreign policy for decades to come. In the telegram, Kennan claimed that the Soviets were committed fanatically to the belief that the U.S. system and way of life must be destroyed. If Soviet power is to be secure, to prevent this outcome, Kennan said the Soviet Union must be contained. within its present borders. After he returned to the United States, Kennan expanded on this notion of foreign policy. Uh, in a foreign policy journal article writing, "It is clear that any United States policy towards the Soviet Union must be that of a long-term, patient but firm, and vigilant commitment of Russian expansive tendencies." Kennan later stated that he viewed the policy of containment, the restriction of Soviet expansion, as a political strategy, not a military one. He did not want war, instead trusting that containment would eventually catalyze either communism's collapse or its transformation into a milder, less hostile system. U.S. leaders had already grown very uneasy by the time Kennan sent his famous telegram, fearing the USSR planned to spread communism beyond Eastern Europe to other parts of the world. Their concerns deepened in March 1946 when the Soviets refused to withdraw troops from northern Iran. Britain and the Soviet Union had shared control of Iran during the war, signaling an agreement in 1942 that stated both countries would withdraw within 6 months of the war's end. By refusing to leave, the Soviets directly ignored this pact, causing the first major post-war crisis. Even though it ended peacefully when the USSR relented to the US pressure and withdrew, the crisis clearly reflected the increasing tension between the two nations. New nuclear technologies raised the stakes for both sides. Conflict between nations had already prompted fears of war. However, in this new age of the atomic bomb, the threat of a superpower conflict became even more frightening. The possibility of nuclear attack compelled both countries to show restraint in their use of force, but it also fueled their race to develop nuclear weapons. After World War II, the United States continued to test and improve its nuclear arsenal. In the summer of 1946, American scientists conducted tests of 2 atomic bombs at Bikini Atoll, located in the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean. Scientists studied the impact of atomic bombs on naval vessels using a fleet of more than 90 battleships and aircraft carriers as targets. Many battleships were old, some were captured enemy ships. Nuclear testing on the Bikini Atoll continued into the 1950s. For 3 years, the United States was the only country that possessed an atomic bomb. Meanwhile, Soviet scientists were earnestly working to develop their own atomic weapons. Turning to the United Nations to mediate conflicts. Truman and his advisors knew the extent of the atomic bomb damage, so they sought ways to control this powerful weapon. They asked the United Nations to help restrict the development of and use of atomic energy, or the power released by a nuclear reaction. In June of 1946, Truman sent a key advisor, Bernard Baruch, to the United Nations to outline U.S. goals in front of the UN Atomic Energy Commission. Baruch told the panel that the United States wanted the United Nations to enact strict limitations on raw materials used to make bombs and to ban the making of future bombs. Under Baruch's proposal, known as the Baruch Plan, the United States would be allowed to retain its small nuclear stockpile for a time being, but would deny the Soviet Union and other nations the right to build bombs. The plan for the UN inspections of nuclear plants and stiff sanctions on violating nations. Furthermore, the UN Security Council members would not be allowed to use their veto power to prevent UN sanctions. The Baruch Plan prompted strong opposition from the Soviet Union. Soviet delegate Andrei Gromyko asked why the United States should be allowed to keep its atomic bombs while the Soviet Union was denied the right to develop weapons. He declared that further talks on international control of atomic weapons could take place only after the United States destroyed all of its atomic weapons. Until then, he refused to discuss the terms of the Baruch Plan and declared that the Soviet Union would not relinquish its Security Council veto power. Because neither side would compromise, this early effort at nuclear arms control came to an end. Speaking to the United Nations in 1946, Presidential Advisor Bernard Baruch proposed a plan for international control of atomic energy. However, the Baruch Plan failed to win Soviet support and was subsequently rejected. The Soviets protested the plan's clause that allowed the United States to retain its nuclear weapons while refusing the Soviet Union's right to build theirs. Confronting the communist threat. On March 5, 1946, Winston Churchill gave a speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, warning of the growing Soviet threat. As British Prime Minister, Churchill had earned the Allies' loyalty and respect by challenging Nazi aggression and leading his nation during World War II. Having known Stalin for years, Churchill was concerned regarding the Soviet dictator's plans for Eastern Europe. In his speech, Churchill cautioned that Stalin was isolating the region from the rest of Europe. From, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, the Prime Minister declared, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The term Iron Curtain came to symbolize the growing barrier between East and West. The Iron Curtain divides Europe. At the time of Churchill's speech, Stalin was already establishing Soviet-controlled governments in Poland and other Eastern European countries. The Soviet Union's regional hegemony, or dominating influence of one country over others, had begun. In Romania, for example, the Soviets forced the king to appoint a pro-communist government. Once in power, Communist Party leaders used secret police to silence all opposition. The Romanian governments promised early elections after protests from the United States and Britain, but Romanian communist officials manipulated the electoral process to ensure it won majority. Bulgaria followed a similar pattern. Supported by the Soviets, local communists employed threats and violence to discharge Romanian government promised early election protests. United States, Britain, but Romanian communist officials manipulated the electoral process. Majority Bulgaria followed a similar pattern. Supported by the Soviets, local communists employed threats and violence to discharge opposing political leaders. Police charged the opposition party leaders with plotting to overthrow the government, and a few months later, officials arrested and executed him. A similar pattern of communist takeover followed in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. 9 days after Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, Stalin responded by defending the communist takeover, explaining that his country needed loyal governments nearby to ensure its security. He questioned how one could see these peaceful aspirations of the Soviet Union as expansionist tendencies. Growing prospects of communism in Greece and Turkey. Concerns about communist expansion were not limited to Eastern Europe. After the war, both Greece and Turkey faced potential communist takeovers as well. In the fall of 1946, civil war erupted in Greece when communist rebels attempted to overtake the Greek government. Yugoslavia, a communist country to the north, backed the rebels, while Britain sent troops and money to support government forces. Britain also tried to help Turkey, which faced growing pressure from the Soviet Union. The USSR sought control of a vital Turkish shipping channel, the Dardanelles, which linked Soviet ports on the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. In 1947, facing severe economic problems of its own, Britain informed the United States that it could no longer afford to assist Greece and Turkey. Truman advocates the containment of communism. Shortly after receiving Britain's message, Truman addressed Congress. In his speech, Truman outlined a policy that became known as the Truman Doctrine. It must be the policy of the United States, he declared, to support the free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. He then requested $400 million from Congress to provide aid to Greece and Turkey. Truman explained the importance of helping these countries resist communism. The seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured by misery and war. They spread and grow in the evil soil of poverty and strife. They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died. We must keep that hope alive. Harry S. Truman from a speech to Congress in 1947. Congress granted Truman's request. With the addition of U.S. aid and military equipment, the Greek government defeated the communist rebels. Likewise, Turkey resisted pressure from the Soviet Union and maintained control of the Dardanelles. The Truman Doctrine committed the United States to foreign policy based on Kennan's strategy of containment. Truman hoped to stop the spread of communism, limiting it to countries in which it already existed. Underlying his policy was the assumption that the Soviet Union sought world domination. Therefore, the United States believed that it had to combat the Soviets with aid as needed and with force if necessary. Scholars still debate how well each side understood the aims and motives of the other. U.S. leaders viewed Eastern Europe communist takeover as a brutal effort to suppress democracy. They saw their own efforts to control nuclear weapons though the United Nations as a noble attempt to maintain peace. In contrast, the Soviets regarded the United States and its allies as hostile powers, committed to destroying communism and threatening Soviet security. They considered efforts to restrict nuclear weapons as U.S. attempts to maintain its monopoly on atomic energy. Each side talked past the other. As one superpower acted, the other reacted. In light of the Soviet threat, Truman asked Congress to reorganize the government security agencies in 1947. In response, Congress passed the National Security Act, which created two new agencies, the National Security Council, NSC, and the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. The NSC advises the President on national security issues and oversees the actions of the CIA. The CIA collects and analyzes intelligence gathered in part by agents operating in foreign countries. NSC, CIA created. Rebuilding European economies. On either side of the Iron Curtain, Europe lay in ruins after the war. One reporter described Warsaw, Poland, as rows of roofless, doorless, windowless walls that looked like they had been dug out of the earth by an army of archaeologists. Britain faced difficulties too, as the country was nearly bankrupt after the war. Conditions worsened during the frigid winter of 1946-47, when Britons faced grave food, fuel, and electricity shortages. In Italy, France, and many other European countries, conditions were even worse. European nations face widespread devastation. Rebuilding war-torn Europe was a daunting challenge. Across the continent, governments and economies barely functioned. Warfare had devastated numerous cities, leaving many of the inhabitants homeless and unemployed. It had destroyed schools, hospitals, churches, and factories. It had knocked out communication systems and ruined ports. It also gravely damaged many roads, bridges, and railroad lines. Without a usable transportation system, transporting raw materials to factories and crops and goods to market was impossible. In the most affected areas, deadly diseases like tuberculosis spread rapidly. U.S. leaders feared Europe's poor condition would fuel political and social unrest. In some countries, workers staged strikes and demonstrations to protest hardships of daily life, while some poor and jobless people looked to communist ideology to solve their problems. Many recalled how local communist groups had resisted the Nazis' rise to power. In these grim and difficult times, communism quickly gained an appeal in Italy and France. The U.S. provides aid through the Marshall Plan. As with Greece and Turkey, Truman believed that rebuilding shattered economies and supporting freely elected governments would best stop communism from spreading. Truman also understood that the strongest economic power in the world, the United States, possessed sufficient money and resources to help Europe rebuild. With these factors in mind, Truman and his advisors developed a plan for European recovery. In June of 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall announced this plan in a speech at Harvard University. In his address, Marshall described the plan as both moral and practical. It is logical that the United States should do whatever it is able to do in assist the normal economic health of the world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. Our policy is directed not against the country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. George Marshall, June 5th, 1947. Really quick. How did the Iron Curtain isolate Eastern Europe? The Iron Curtain was both physical and ideological barrier. The physical barrier consisted of fences that stopped the movement of people across borders. The ideological barrier was less visible but equally real. Communist leaders worked hard to block the flow of foreign ideas into their countries. Border fences made unauthorized travel into and out of Iron Curtain countries difficult and dangerous. The divided capital of Berlin, the Iron Curtain was a wall that sealed free West Berlin off from Communist East Berlin. The United States created Radio Free Europe to transmit news and information across the Iron Curtain. RFE signals were often jammed or blocked by communist countries. All right, here we go into the Marshall Plan. This recovery plan became known as the Marshall Plan, offering all European nations, including the Soviet Union, generous funding to rebuild their economies so long as the money was spent on goods made in the United States. The plan appealed to many U.S. leaders. Its supporters hoped the plan would promote democracy in Europe while opposing the spread of communism. Thus promote democracy in Europe while opposing the spread of communism, thus reinforcing the Truman Doctrine and the policy of containment. They also wanted to expand markets for American goods to further boost the U.S. economy. Some congressional Republicans initially opposed what they called his New Deal for Europe. However, the Marshall Plan gained widespread support in the spring of 1948 after lawmakers learned of the Communist Party taking control of Czechoslovakia. That year, Congress approved over $13 billion in aid, which would be spent over a four-year period from 1948 to 1952. This aid would be critical to stimulating the economic growth and prosperity in Western Europe. The USSR responds with the Molotov Plan. Although the United States portrayed the Marshall Plan as a generous effort to aid European recovery, Soviet leaders questioned its motives. They believed that the true purpose of the plan was to create a U.S. sphere of influence in Western Europe. Stalin, in particular, viewed the Marshall Plan as an attempt to interfere with Soviet internal affairs. The Soviets knew that in order to receive aid, they would have to share information about their economy and resources with the United States, even allowing U.S. inspectors into their country to observe how the aid was being used. Stalin felt that by accepting American aid, his government would cede some control over the economic planning and decision-making to the United States. For these reasons, the Soviet Union chose not to take power, chose not to take money, chose not to take money, chose not to take power. Money. Czechoslovakia, however, was eager to accept the Marshall Plan, so Czech leaders met with Stalin in Moscow to obtain his approval. They explained that two-thirds of the raw materials Czechoslovakia needed for manufacturing came from Western countries. Stalin denied their request, stating that they could not cooperate in an action aimed at isolating the Soviet Union. In the end, at the urging of the Soviets, no Eastern European nations participated in the Marshall Plan. To compete with its rival superpower, the Soviet Union created the Molotov Plan, named after Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov in 1949. This plan was designed to aid economic recovery in Eastern Europe by establishing a new organization, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon. Initially, Comecon's primary task was to develop two-way trade agreements between Soviet Union and Comecon members. In the 1950s, Comecon attempted more ambitious projects, including working to integrate Eastern Europe economies by encouraging member states to specialize in different goods and services from one another. A Cold War has begun. By 1949, the wartime alliance of the United States and the Soviet Union had shifted into a relationship of mutual distrust and suspicion. Each side envisioned a different version of the world. The United States wanted to promote the growth of independent capitalist democracies. The Soviet Union aimed to surround itself with loyal communist states. The two superpowers had clashed over communist takeovers in Eastern Europe, Iran, and less directly in Greece and Turkey. They had argued over atomic energy and plans for post-war economic recovery in Europe. But although the hostility between the two superpowers and the Allies often swelled, it never led to armed conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. For that reason, this post-war struggle became known as the Cold War. During the Cold War, Europe and much of the world divided into two hostile camps. The United States and the Soviet Union waged a war of words, using propaganda, diplomacy, economic and military aid, and espionage as weapons. Each superpower believed that its own motives and actions were right and good, while casting its rivals' efforts in a bad light. Compromise and cooperation became greater challenges as the conflict grew, especially when the development of atomic weapons heightened fears of a nuclear arms race. Both sides knew that if the Cold War became hot, it could potentially catalyze the most destructive world war in human history. In the post-war period, clear differences between the United States and the Soviet Union soon emerged. Communist ideology and the creation of Soviet-backed states in Eastern Europe alarmed the U.S. government. The United States responded with efforts to support European democracy and limit Soviet expansion. As the rivalry intensified, Europe divided into communist-controlled Eastern Europe and mostly democratic Western Europe. Yalta and Potsdam conferences. At Yalta, Allied leaders convened to shape post-war Europe. They divided Germany and Berlin into four occupation zones and declared their support for self-government and free elections in Eastern Europe. At Potsdam, leaders finalized their post-war plans for Germany. However, the relationship between the superpowers began to weaken. At Yalta, they divided Germany. At Potsdam, they started to be suspicious of each other with like Truman and Stalin there. Iron Curtain. In a 1946 speech, Winston Churchill accused the Soviet Union of dividing Europe into East and West, dropping an Iron Curtain as a barrier across the continent. UN Atomic Energy Commission at the United Nations. The United States outlined a plan to limit the development of atomic weapons. The Soviet Union, developing its own atomic bomb, rejected U.S. efforts to retain a monopoly on atomic energy. Truman Doctrine. President Truman adopted a policy of containment as part of the Truman Doctrine. This doctrine aimed to limit the spread of communism and support global democracy. Marshall Plan. This aid program reflected the Truman Doctrine's goals. It provided aid to European nations to help them recover from the war, promote stability, and limit the appeal of communism in their countries. The Soviets responded with the Molotov Plan for Eastern Europe. Cold War. The post-war struggle for power between the United States and the Soviet Union became known as the Cold War. Although it was largely a war of words and influence, the Cold War threatened to heat up and spark armed conflict between the superpowers. During the Marshall Plan's four-year duration, the United States provided over $12 billion in aid to 16 European countries. This was less than the Congress had originally authorized, but the funds still boosted Western European economies tremendously. American supporters of the Marshall Plan believed that it both supported the Truman Doctrine and containment policy. During the Cold War, the United States and USSR engaged in a tug-of-war over world power and influence. Conflict centered in part on the development of atomic weapons.